As the one and only Peter Dockers writes above me, a spectacular match just finished up between Richard Rapport and Wei Yi in China. Today in this video, I'd like to review some of the most exciting and potentially the most instructive moments from that match between these two very young stars. Hungarian Grandmaster Richard Rapport took on Chinese sensation Wei Yi in his home country, and this was the first game I'd like to take a look at. In this position here, Wei Yi was white, and it seemed as though Richard Rapport had found all the defensive moves that were needed. He's obviously gobbled up a few pawns here, and if the position continues to simplify, black will be winning very quickly. One of the things you have to consider, though, whenever your opponent's king is in the middle of the board is every opportunity to get at it. That's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, as I like to say, to sacrifice everything. But if you're not forcing yourself to have more than just one candidate move, then you're missing opportunities very often. So in this position, I'm going to let you pause the video, as I'm going to do in each of these games, and try to assess for yourself what Wei Yi played here before I continue forward with the analysis and show you exactly what that was. Okay, and now that you've had a moment to pause the video, let's see what the engine tells us was played. Of course, we already know that the engine's going to see a brilliant tactic right away, the move knight takes f7. A very, very strong move, not just because it forks the king and rook, therefore forcing bishop takes e6, but it's really the catalyst to every other piece that has currently been sort of locked out of the big show to get into the game with this move e6. So to back up quickly and show you the purpose, as you assess this king on d8, he's really safe there because of one reason, this pawn on e5. We wish we could just take it off the board, and white might have all the avenues he needs for the rooks and the queen and the bishop to get involved. And sometimes when we play imaginary chess in our brains, like, what do I need for this position to break through? It can be helpful because it can force us to see things that maybe otherwise we weren't considering. Knight takes f7 is just a brilliant shot, and after e6, the whole position starts to fall apart for Rapport. Rook takes e6 is followed by a forcing set of captures. The key is this queen doesn't have any way to check on the back rank because this rook will always come back and block it. And as soon as that rook's gone, as you're about to see, Wei Yi simply never stops with the forcing moves, and therefore doesn't let black ever get opportunities at the white king on the back rank. After takes, he gets a check, and now not a single move is played for the rest of the game that is not a check until the final moment where Rapport simply resigns because the queen now guards the b1 square, which prevents queen b1, and that means as soon as the king moves, white can finally gobble up this rook on h8 because the bishop on h8 still guards the a1 square. So as you saw there, this was the first big win by Wei Yi as white in this match, and now we're going to take a quick look at Richard Rapport's attempt to strike back and even up things as he did. And this game now, with Rapport playing the white pieces, we see that black has some positional problems, some doubled pawns, and this king is in the center, creating a little bit of communication issues there between the pieces. But from white's perspective, white now has to deal with the compensation black normally gets in what was a French defense, as black is getting counterplay and threatening to just take e3, right, and get access to the king. In addition to that, there's some awkwardness because of the g file and this g2 pawn being under fire, which prevents this knight from maybe ever being aggressive. The reason that's important is because what you have to anticipate in every position is not just whether your pieces are on their best squares now, but are they on their best squares with the coming threats of my opponent, right? Prophylactic thinking, putting yourself in your opponent's shoes, not always the easiest thing to do. But black is threatening f5 because regardless of how white would gobble that pawn, the g2 pawn's going to fall. So how is white going to deal with all of these issues? Do you really want to put the king over there on the g-file where the attack is going to get out of control? But how are you dealing with this threat? Well, Rapport came up with a very, very strong positional tactical move, I like to call it. And if you don't want to pause your video and solve it, then you're doing the right thing. But if you do want to pause the video and take a guess at what you might play here, thinking about all the little things I've mentioned here in a very sneaky way to try to foreshadow what was done, you can do it. But if not, we're about to turn on the engine and give you my further instructive analysis. Here it goes. Okay. The move played by Rapport is this very, very strong move, g3, exclam. A move that sort of solves everything by removing the pawn from attack, guarding this knight that's on the edge of the board so that f5 isn't at least devastating. The only one it doesn't solve, though, is that can't black take on e3? Well, the problem is that d takes e3, and this is likely what Wei Yi may have underestimated, will be met now by just castles. and suddenly we realize that actually the sacrifice of that pawn and the opening of the position gives white a ton of long-term compensation. Suddenly we're not looking at a situation where white's king was the one dealing with tactics, but actually white's getting everything he needed from a few moves ago, where yes, black's king is sort of under fire, but there's no open files to get at the king. There's no real access points. So if Wei Yi had taken this pawn, Rapport would have castled, sacrificed it, and gone on likely to win in pretty exciting fashion. With the other rook joining the party on the e-file, this might have been a very crushing attack. So, because of that, after g3, Wei Yi does his best to kind of maintain the balance of the position. He doesn't want to upset the balance. He knows his king is in potential danger, but you also have to be careful if you're black here, because if the position simplifies too far and this pony just establishes itself on f5, that's going to be a good knight versus a bad bishop, right? And that's going to be an endgame where nobody likes getting grinded out as black in situations like that. So he plays queen d5, but Rapport has everything set in mind to force the simplification as I just talked about. He starts with e4 and then a very timely sacrifice of the c3 pawn with b3. Even if the queens don't trade and the queen backs up, a move like c4 just to block everything is going to get the kind of position I was talking about where the knight will dominate the bishop. Evals from the computer are, almost about 3/4 of a pawn, but really with grandmasters it's even more than that. Just a very comfortable position for white. Because of that, we see the capture, but now after the quick castle's long, you realize that the extra pawn means nothing for black, as the engine even agrees with us. You know you're in trouble when you're up a pawn and you're just down so much positionally. Doubled isolated pawns, isolated pawn, doubled pawns, not isolated, but when the fact that white gets the d-file quickly, they might as well be isolated. And here's how Rapport quickly finished it off. You know Wei Yi's desperate because he has to sacrifice this pawn just to get some freedom for his bishop before that pony lands itself there. But that means that now not only is black not up a pawn, but he really hasn't solved the bigger problems of his positional weaknesses. White gobbled up the pawns and headed into a pretty easily rook ending. We're just going to make a few more moves to show you how white's massive majority, once this g and f pawns get rolling, just got out of control here. And white went on to win this rook ending. So this led us to a tied match, which meant that the players were heading into a blitz and rapid playoff with eventually a potential Armageddon game if they stayed tied. Well, stay tied they did. Both players won with the black pieces, and that set us up for this final game you're about to see, where these two players were not going to disappoint us. Certainly in a single Armageddon game, they would play something exciting, right? Well, let's take a look at what happened in this game and who won this match. The most exciting thing about this last playoff game is that it really was a back-and-forth affair. Wasn't joking or blowing smoke when I said these two players delivered in an exciting Armageddon game. And it starts right here in this critical position where Rapport is black, Wei Yi is white. Say it the opposite way. Wei Yi is white, Rapport is black. And the white king is under fire, but obviously c4 is going to punt back the bishop to c6, and white is going to maintain this really nice bind of the knights on the king side. You'd think that would be the case, right? But no. Rapport is ready, and as you can see from the position, with a little bit of time to think, the engine actually agrees with what Rapport did. He took on c4 with the knight. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the position is over by any means. You're looking at what is clearly just a nuts game, right? White is up a piece and has a very potentially dangerous position for the black king on the king side. If the rooks ever got involved on open files, that's how bad things happen to the king, right? You get Arabian mating nets, Anastasia's mating net, all kinds of weird stuff that the rook and knights are capable of. But the issue here for white is first Wei Yi is going to have to deal with the threats from Rapport. Bishop to b6 shows that black doesn't need the queen to conduct a mating attack. Here come threats like bishop a5 check. The rook is infiltrating. Things are getting messy. Because of that, white goes on the run and kind of shows a little bit of his hand here in trying to win. The issue, though, I think one of the biggest justifications behind Rapport's sacrifice is that really Wei Yi had to play for the win, because if you know the rules to an Armageddon game, that means that if black draws this game, he wins. So essentially, by opening up this position, even if he had just calculated to this little tickle here with the king, Rapport was probably making the right practical decision. Wei Yi's only way to avoid the repetition and the match would be to walk the king up into a very precarious position on f3. Rapport now gobbles up his third pawn, which is going to allow him to keep putting pressure on the king and maybe have an outside chance of turning one of these little ladies into a full-grown woman. That's a queen. But okay, Wei Yi's not giving up. He plays g4, and as you can even see in the position, despite the awkward, precarious moment, the engine really still prefers white. Still feels like Wei Yi had very good chances in this game. After h takes and king takes, the Chinese is doing exactly what he needs to do to try to create open lines for the knights and the rooks to work together against the king. It's a very instructive thing to see that when your king is in an awkward position, instead of struggling with ways to put your pieces on bad squares and maybe get him safely tucked away, look for it as an opportunity to maybe be more aggressive and bring him further into the fold. As long as you are putting the responsibility on your shoulders to calculate accurately, you can do this sort of thing. And that's exactly what happens as we move forward. Rapport says, you know what, I don't have time to even worry about my b7 pawn. I know I need counterplay if I'm going to stay in this game. But Wei Yi is gobbling up pawns, and as you see, the evaluation is getting bigger and bigger for white here. White is headed the direction you would think to be a win in this game because he's able to get one of his pawns back. Black has no clear threats with this pawn, and this king is still awkward. One of my, I guess, factors that I weigh, not only when I'm giving advice to students or in my own games, about whether or not I should sacrifice a piece is it's not just about getting pawns. Sometimes some people say, well, as long as you have 3 pawns for the piece, isn't the material equal? Usually not. Usually even 4 pawns can't really justify themselves against a piece, because as tactics ensue in a middle game, a piece is a piece and pawns are pawns. So the only way you can really ever make a pawn justify itself for a piece sacrifice is if that pawn is threatening to become a bigger piece, him or herself, right? So that's a really important thing to remember, that when you're evaluating these positions, sometimes you have no choice but to go, cowboy up and go just, eyes down and put those blinders on and try to do everything you can to make that pawn push. That's what Black does here. He plays bishop b3, which has a very clear intention. I need to make sure I have chances to rush this pawn up the board. But Wei Yi is not looking back in regards to creating the counterplay. Unfortunately for him, probably one of the biggest critical moments was right here, where he decided to stick with this, maybe rather than switch gears and keep the bind on the pieces here so that a-pawn didn't get too far. Very complicated. I'm not really in a position to fully criticize them, regardless of what the engine thinks. I don't really care. It's just there for the people who like the engine. But as far as our instructive moments, I will say that it felt like Wei Yi was still headed on the right path to try to create open lines and get at that king. But perhaps what was miscalculated was exactly this move, bishop c2, which gains a tempo on the rook and very importantly threatens bishop f5 check, which is going to put this king right back in one of those awkward positions he was in before, where he might be in a mating net. That's exactly what Rapport was able to do and get a little more counterplay whilst, here the whilst word, helping the a-pawn push up the board. Bishop comes into d4, and white knows he's going to be in a little bit of trouble here because that a-pawn is going to become a full-grown lady. Because of that, he looks for opportunities to maybe give himself up. Look at this nice rook a8 move, right? It takes advantage of the pinned bishop. White had calculated that he could make these sacrifices because of the thing I foreshadowed long ago. There's a mating net happening here against the black king. But unfortunately, as our buddy Stockfish reveals, black does have tricks to get out of it, starting with this awesome sacrifice one piece back, bring the rook down to guard the mate, and then get out of dodge here by sacrificing and then pushing. Finally, we see the smoke is clearing, and at the end of the big, massive shootout, we have a queen that's about to appear on the A file, which means that this match, foreshadowing done, time to reveal the results. Spoiler alert: Richard Rapport won this match in China, flying to the Far East and taking down the Chinese on his home turf. Wei Yi, of course, still just an absolute rising star, maybe somebody who we expect to challenge for the throne. You heard it here first, and in a few years from now. But Rapport, in this case, the young Hungarian, also a super talent, takes this match, takes it home by winning in an amazingly awesome, tactical, aggressive fashion in the Armageddon game. And hopefully you enjoyed some of these instructive and critical moments from their match. Appreciate. Give us some feedback. Give us a like. Give us a share. Let us know how you like this kind of video. Obviously, this one should have probably been dubbed a little more like match of the day rather than game of the day, but I hope you enjoyed the extra content nonetheless, and we'll see you around on chess.com.